The neon sign for the rusty anchor flickered with a dying buzz, casting a jagged red glow over the row of chrome-heavy bikes lined up like sharks in the gravel. I checked my mirrors, the heavy rumble of my rig vibrating through the soles of my boots, a sound that usually felt like home. But as I stared at the door my father used to hold open for me when I was just a kid in oversized flannels, a cold knot tightened in my gut. The air didn't smell like rain anymore. It smelled like stale beer and the sharp, metallic tang of a fight looking for a place to happen. Inside, the jukebox was screaming something jagged that drowned out the wind, and for a second I saw a shadow hit the frosted glass, a body being shoved hard. My hand stayed on the door handle of the cab, every instinct telling me to put the truck in gear and let this town disappear in the rear view, but then I heard it. A woman's stifled cry, sharp and terrified, cut through the mechanical hum of my engine. I knew right then that if I kept driving, I'd be leaving a piece of my soul in that gravel lot, and some debts are paid in more than just miles. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The air inside the anchor hit me like a physical blow, thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, unwashed denim, and that particular brand of arrogance that only comes when a pack of wolves thinks they've found a sheep. I kept my head down, my old ball cap pulled low, and made a straight line for the far end of the bar. I just wanted a coffee, something to cut the road weariness before the final leg to the coast. But the atmosphere was brittle. 3 men in grease-stained leather vests were crowded around a small table in the center of the room, their laughter sounding like glass, breaking in a dark alley. A young waitress, couldn't have been more than 20, was pinned between the table and the wall. Her tray was shaking, the glasses on it rattling a frantic, rhythmic warning. One of the bikers, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jawline and lead stitched over his heart, had his hand wrapped tight around her wrist. He wasn't even looking at her. He was leaning back, basking in the silence he'd forced on the room. The bartender, an old man I vaguely remembered as a friend of my father's, was standing behind the tap with his hands visible, his face a mask of helpless fury. I felt the heat rising in my neck, that old familiar hum of adrenaline that I'd spent years trying to quiet. I took a slow breath, tasting the grit in the air, and focused on the scarred wood of the bar. "Mind your business, Jack," I told myself. "You're just passing through." I said, "I don't think you heard me, honey," the biker growled, his voice a low, wet rasp. He pulled the girl closer, forcing her to stumble. "I asked for the special treatment, the kind your boss says you're real good at." "Idun," the girl's voice was a whisper, thin and breaking. "Please, sir, I'm just trying to do my job. Let go." "I'll let go when I'm finished," he sneered, and his friends roared with laughter, one of them slapping the table so hard a beer bottle toppled over, shattering on the floor. I felt the shift in the room before I realized I was moving. The mind your business part of me had been drowned out by the memory of my own daughter's voice, the way she used to sound when she was scared. I didn't run. I didn't yell. I just walked over, my boots heavy and rhythmic on the floor, and stopped 2 feet from their table. I didn't look at the bikers. I looked at the girl. "Mom," I said, my voice low and level, the way you talk to a skittish horse. "I think your boss needs a hand with the coffee filter back there. Why don't you go help him?" The room went dead silent. The jukebox chose that exact moment to skip, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the doorframe. The man named Lead slowly turned his head, his grip tightening on the girl's wrist until her knuckles went white. He looked me up and down, taking in the grease on my jeans and the worn-out edges of my work coat. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "And who the hell are you? Father Time?" He spat. His buddies stood up, their chairs screeching against the floor like a warning. They were younger, broader, and they moved with the practiced coordination of men who spent their weekends breaking bones. "Just a driver," I said, keeping my hands visible but relaxed at my sides. and I'm telling you, you're making a mistake. Let the lady go." Lead laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He stood up, and he was taller than he looked sitting down. He took a step into my space, the smell of sour bourbon coming off him in waves. A driver, a fat old trucker who thinks he's a hero. "You probably spend your nights crying into a CB radio, don't you?" He reached out and poked me hard in the chest, right over my heart. "You got a lot of nerve, old man. Maybe you didn't see the bikes outside." "I saw them," I said. My heart rate was steady, a slow, heavy thud. "I also see a man who thinks he's bigger than he is because he's got a patch on his back and a girl in a corner." The biker's eyes turned mean. He looked down at my forearm, where the edge of my old unit tattoo, a faded, jagged line of ink, peeked out from under my sleeve. "Wait a second," he mocked, leaning in close. "Is that a little soldier boy mark? Look at this, boys. We got ourselves a veteran. Thank you for your service, Grandpa. Now why don't you take your PTSD and your rusted-out rig and crawl back into whatever hole you came from before I decide to see if you still remember how to bleed?" He didn't wait for an answer. He shoved me, a hard, two-handed strike intended to send me stumbling back into the bar stools. But I didn't stumble. I let the momentum take me back just enough to find my footing, my center of gravity locking in. The girl took the chance to scramble away, ducking behind the bar, and that was the moment the door on the old life swung wide open. "You should have let her go," I whispered. Lid lunged. It was a sloppy, arrogant swing, a wide right hook fueled by ego. I didn't even have to think. I stepped inside the arc of his arm, the air whistling past my ear, and drove the palm of my hand into his solar plexus. The air left him in a sickening whoomp. As he doubled over, I grabbed the back of his head and guided it, not hard, just firm, into the edge of the heavy oak table he'd been sitting at. His nose cracked like a dry branch. His two friends didn't hesitate. The one on the left, a wiry guy with a chain belt, pulled a collapsible baton from his boot. The other, a massive wall of a man, just charged. I moved. I didn't have the luxury of a fair fight. I grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the bar and hurled it at the big one's face. It caught him square on the cheek, staggering him long enough for me to deal with the chain. The wiry biker swung the baton. I felt the wind of it graze my shoulder. I stepped into his guard, caught his wrist, and twisted until I heard the distinct pop of a shoulder luxation. He screamed, dropping the weapon, and I followed up with a short, sharp elbow to his temple that shut his lights out instantly. The big one was back on his feet, blood streaming down his face, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look like a wolf anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. He reached behind his back, his hand disappearing under his vest, and my blood ran cold. I knew that reach. "Don't do it," I warned, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He didn't listen. He pulled a snub-nosed revolver, but before he could level the barrel, I was on him. I didn't think about the miles I had left to drive or the quiet life I'd built. I only thought about the weight of the steel and the heat in the room. I caught his gun hand, my thumb digging into the nerve cluster in his wrist, and slammed his arm down onto the bar. The gun fired a deafening roar that shattered the mirror behind the bar, raining glass down like diamonds. I didn't let go. I drove my knee into his thigh, deadening the muscle, then used my weight to whip him around, slamming his face into the beer taps. Foam sprayed everywhere, mixing with the blood on the floor. I stood there for a second, my chest heaving, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp on my tongue. Lead was groaning on the floor, clutching his face. The wiry one was out cold. The big one was slumped against the kegs, his breathing ragged. The bar was silent again, except for the hiss of the broken beer line. "I told you," I said, looking down at Lead, who was staring up at me with one eye swollen shut. "You picked the wrong truck tonight." I turned to the bartender, who was staring at me as if he'd seen a ghost. "Call the sheriff, Bill. Tell him there's a Dashcam record of these boys hitting a car 3 miles back near the junction 2. My rig caught the whole thing. They were looking for trouble long before they walked in here. I didn't wait for him to answer. I walked back to the girl, who was still shaking behind the bar. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and set it on the counter. "For the coffee I didn't get to finish," I said softly. She looked at me, her eyes wet, and reached out to touch my hand. "Why did you stay? You could have just left." I looked at the door, then back at the memory of my father. "Some roads you can't just drive past, Ma'am. Some roads you have to stand your ground." The heavy oak door of the Anchor groaned shut behind me, but the silence of the gravel lot didn't last long. I could hear the big one, the one I'd slammed into the beer taps, stumbling out the side exit, his boots crunching frantically on the stones. He wasn't running away. He was heading for the line of bikes. My eyes adjusted to the moonlight, and I saw the glint of metal in his hand. He wasn't reaching for a gun this time. He was reaching for a heavy-duty chain locked to the frame of the lead chopper. "You think you're just walking to your truck, old man?" he roared, his voice thick with blood and broken pride. Two more figures emerged from the shadows of the building, backups they'd kept in the alley, younger kids with prospect patches who looked like they were starving for a chance to prove they were just as mean as Lead. They spread out in a semicircle, cutting off my path to the rig. The big one swung the chain, the heavy links whistling through the air with a terrifying kinetic energy. This wasn't a bar scuffle anymore. This was a strategic ambush designed to make sure I never made it back to the interstate. I didn't back up. Backing up gives a predator momentum. Instead, I stepped into the light of my own headlights, letting them see the calm on my face, the kind of calm that usually precedes a storm. "You've got about 10 seconds before the local deputies clear that ridge," I said, my voice steady enough to make the youngest prospect hesitate. "If you want to spend the next 5 years eating through a straw in a county cell, keep swinging that chain." The big one didn't care about the law. He lunged, the chain coming at my head in a lethal arc. I ducked, the metal links grazing the top of my cap, and drove my shoulder into his midsection, lifting him off his feet. We hit the gravel hard. I felt the sharp stones bite into my knees, but I didn't let up. I pinned his arm and used a pressure point behind his jaw to force the chain from his grip. As I rolled away, the two prospects charged. I used the heavy chain like a whip, catching the first one across the shins and the second across the chest. They went down in a heap of tangled limbs and cursing. The big man scrambled back up, his eyes bloodshot and wild, looking for anything to use as a weapon. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a side bag on the nearest bike and swung it with everything he had. I moved with the fluidity of a man half my age, a ghost of the soldier I used to be. I parried the wrench with the chain, the metal-on-metal clang echoing off the side of my trailer like a gunshot. With a sudden, violent jerk, I wrapped the chain around the wrench and yanked it from his hand, sending the tool flying into the darkness. Before he could recover, I landed a 3-punch combination, ribs, solar plexus, chin, that sent him crashing back into the bikes, a row of chrome collapsing like dominoes. I stood over him, the chain still wrapped around my hand, breathing in the cold air and the scent of spilled oil. He looked up at me, the arrogance finally replaced by a raw, naked fear. He realized then what Led had failed to see inside. I wasn't an old man trying to be a hero. I was a professional who had been pushed past the point of no return. "The Dashcam didn't just catch the hit and run," I said, pointing up at the glowing blue light in my windshield. "It's been live streaming this whole parking lot to a secure server for the last 10 minutes. Every swing, every threat, every face, it's already in the hands of the state police." The sirens began to wail in the distance, a high-pitched scream cutting through the night. The prospects scrambled to their feet and vanished into the woods, but the big man just stayed there in the dirt, defeated by a man he thought was an easy target. I dropped the chain, the heavy links clattering against the gravel, and walked toward my cab without looking back. I didn't just pull away into the darkness. I sat there in the idling cab for a long minute, watching the scene through my side mirror, as the high-intensity reality of the situation fully set in. The deputy in charge, a man with graying temples and a look of permanent exhaustion, walked over to my door and gave a sharp, two-fingered rap against the metal. I rolled the window down, the cold mountain air rushing back in, smelling of pine and spent gunpowder. "You're Mercer, right? Jack Mercer?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a weight of recognition. He didn't wait for me to answer. He looked at the carnage in the gravel, the bikes piled like scrap metal, and the big man groaning as he was hauled into a cruiser, then back at me. "I remember you. 12 years ago, outside of Carson City. You're the one who pulled that family out of the burning sedan before the fuel line went." I didn't smile. I didn't even nod. "I'm just a driver, deputy. I've got 4 tons of refrigerated goods that don't care about my history." "Well, just a driver just saved that girl's life," he said, stepping back and tapping the side of my truck in a gesture of quiet respect. "The dashcam footage already hit the server. It's clean. These boys have been a plague on this county for 6 months. You did what we couldn't. You caught them in the act and you held the line." I watched him walk away to coordinate the tow trucks, but I wasn't finished. Before I could shift into gear, a black SUV with tinted windows drifted into the lot, parking a few yards from my front bumper. 2 men stepped out. Not cops, but not bikers either. They wore suits that cost more than my first 3 rigs combined, and they moved with a predatory grace that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They were the legal muscle for whatever organization backed Leeds' crew, and they weren't here to offer a handshake. The taller one walked up to my cab, his face a mask of polished indifference. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice as smooth as silk and just as cold. "You've caused a significant amount of property damage tonight. My clients are very attached to those machines." I leaned out the window, looking him dead in the eye. "Your clients are attached to a cage right now, and if you don't move that SUV in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to see how attached you are to your front-end alignment." He didn't move. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket, pulling out a thick envelope. "We're prepared to offer a settlement for the dashcam hardware. We'd hate for a man of your experience to have to deal with the complications of a lengthy court battle. It was a bribe, plain and simple, a way to make the receipts disappear." I felt that old, jagged spark of injustice flare up again. I didn't take the envelope. I opened my door, forcing him to step back into the dirt. I climbed down, standing a full head taller than him, the physical presence I'd honed through years of combat and long hauls acting as a silent threat. "You see that blue light?" I asked, pointing to the lens mounted on the dash. "It's not just recording. It's broadcasting. Every word you just said, every cent in that envelope is currently being viewed by a federal prosecutor I happen to know from my time in the service." The man's composure finally cracked. He looked at the camera, then back at me, his eyes darting toward the deputies who were now watching us with sudden interest. He realized he'd just walked into a trap of his own making. He didn't say another word. He just signaled his partner, and they retreated to the SUV, peeling out of the lot with a spray of gravel that felt like a surrender. I walked back toward the bar one last time. The waitress, Sarah, was sitting on a bench, still wrapped in my jacket. She looked smaller now, the shadows of the night stretching long across the porch. I sat down beside her, not saying anything at first, just letting the silence of the mountains settle the dust. "My dad used to bring me here," I said quietly, looking at the flickering neon of the anchor. "He told me that a man's worth isn't measured by the miles he covers, but by what he leaves behind when he stops. Tonight, I think I finally understood what he meant." She looked at me, her eyes clearing. "You're a good man, Jack, even if you don't want to admit it." I stood up, adjusting my cap. "I'm just a man who's seen enough people get hurt. Take care of yourself, Sarah, and keep that jacket. The road ahead looks like it's going to be a cold one." I walked back to the rig, the heavy door clicking shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter. I checked my gauges. Oil pressure steady, air tanks full. I put the truck in gear, the 18-wheeler groaning as it began to roll. As I pulled out onto the highway, the headlights cutting through the mist, I looked in the mirror one last time. The anchor was a small, glowing speck in the distance, a lighthouse in a storm I'd managed to survive. The road stretched out before me, endless and indifferent, but for the first time in a long time, the weight of the past didn't feel quite so heavy. I was still moving, still driving, a lone guardian on the grey ribbon of the American night. The sirens cut through the mountain air, their blue and red pulses reflecting off the polished sides of my trailer as the deputies finally swarmed the lot. I watched through the driver's side window, the weight of the night settling into my joints, while they zip-tied the big man and searched the woods for the prospects who had bolted into the dark. The adrenaline was cooling, leaving behind that familiar hollow ache that comes when you're forced to be the man you promised you'd leave behind in the desert. I stepped down from the cab, the gravel crunching under my boots, and saw the waitress, the one they'd pinned against the table, standing near the doorway. Her thin arms were wrapped around herself against the biting wind. I didn't say a word. I just reached back into the sleeper, grabbed my old fleece-lined work jacket, and draped it over her shoulders. "You're going to be all right now," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper against the hum of the idling engine. "They won't be coming back." She looked up at me, the terror in her eyes replaced by a quiet, flickering sort of hope. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you stay so calm when the world is falling apart?" I looked at the faded ink on my arm, the jagged line of a life spent in shadows, then out at the long, dark stretch of the interstate waiting for me. "I don't stay calm, Mom," I said, shifting my weight. "I just know that some things are worth the fight and some people are worth protecting." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small, folded stack of bills I'd tucked away for a new set of tires, and pressed them into her hand. Before she could protest, I was back in the driver's seat. I didn't wait for a thank you or a handshake. Heroes in this life don't stick around for the applause. I engaged the air brakes, the hiss of the release sounding like a final breath, and pulled the rig back onto the asphalt. As the lights of the anchor faded in my rear view, I was just another shadow moving through the night, a man still trying to do a little bit of good in a world that often forgets how to be kind. Thank you for watching, and if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.